The auction room smelled like dust and burnt coffee when the gavel came down. One sharp crack of wood, and just like that, my family's 3,500-acre farm was gone. Sold for less than the price of a used pickup truck. No gasps. No outrage. Just a quiet shuffle of papers and a man I had never seen before shaking hands with the auctioneer. It took me a few seconds to realize why my stomach dropped so hard. The buyer wasn't random. He was tied directly to the president of the HOA that had been harassing me for months. My name is Caleb Whitmore. I'm a retired property attorney, and I moved back to Red Willow County, Wyoming, after my wife, Lillian Whitmore, passed away. This land wasn't just dirt and fences to me. It was where my grandfather built something from nothing. It was where my wife wanted her ashes scattered when she was gone. The HOA claimed my farm was suddenly under their authority. They used that lie to fine me, lien me, and finally foreclose. What they didn't know was that I spent decades dismantling corrupt HOAs for a living, and they had just made the worst mistake of their lives. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Whitmore Hollow Farm has been in my family since 1954. That was the year my grandfather, Henry Whitmore, came home from the service, stood on a stretch of high desert most people thought was useless, and decided to build a life anyway. There was no paved road back then, no power lines. Just wind, rock, and stubborn land that fought every improvement. He dug the first well by hand. He ran fence posts until his palm split. Every inch of that 3,500 acres was earned, not inherited. My father expanded it, modernized it, turned it into a working operation that fed 3 generations. By the time it was mine, the land carried history in every rut and fence line. I didn't plan to come back full-time. I built a career in the city as a property attorney, specializing in boundary disputes, title defects, and HOA overreach. Ironically, most of my career was spent protecting people from exactly the kind of thing that would later happen to me. I met my wife Lillian at a county fundraiser. She loved this land as much as I did. When the doctors told us she didn't have much time left, she made one request. She wanted her ashes scattered at the old cottonwood near the west pasture, where the sunsets stretch forever. When she passed, the city felt unbearable. Every street corner reminded me of hospitals and waiting rooms. So I retired early, sold the practice, and came home to Whitmore Hollow to grieve quietly. I wanted dust on my boots, wind in my ears, and long days where no one asked anything of me. That peace lasted less than a year. The first sign of trouble was construction noise, bulldozers, backup alarms, earth movers grinding away at dawn. On the eastern boundary of my land, a developer carved up former grazing parcels into something called Juniper Ridge Estates. Big houses, stone entry signs, decorative fences that stopped at the illusion of rural living. The people who moved in wanted open skies and postcard views, but they didn't want cattle, dust, or the smell of hay. They wanted the idea of the country without the reality of it. At first, I kept my distance. I waved when neighbors drove by. I minded my business. Then, one morning, a black SUV rolled up my driveway like it owned the place. Out stepped Elaine Prescott. She was dressed like she belonged in a real estate brochure. Perfect hair, crisp blazer, a smile that never reached her eyes. She introduced herself as the president of the Juniper Ridge Estates Homeowners Association and spoke slowly, carefully, like she was explaining something simple to a child. She told me there had been a recent boundary adjustment. According to her, part of my land now fell under HOA jurisdiction. I didn't laugh, even though every legal instinct in my body told me this was nonsense. You don't just adjust boundaries on land that predates your subdivision by decades. That requires surveys, filings, hearings, and consent. I calmly asked her for documentation. She handed me a thin packet of papers that raised more questions than answers. No original survey. No county stamps I recognized. No recorded consent. When I asked for the underlying filings, she smiled again and said those were being processed. That was the first red flag. The second came a week later when I received my first violation notice. Apparently, my tractor was unauthorized equipment. Then came complaints about noise. Then dust. Then hay storage. All things that had existed long before Juniper Ridge Estates ever poured its first foundation. I requested formal proof of jurisdiction in writing. The response was silence, followed by more notices. More fines, all vague, all escalating, none grounded in real authority. Elaine returned once more, standing at my gate, clipboard in hand, talking about community standards and shared responsibility. She never raised her voice. She never threatened me outright. But everything about her tone said the same thing: comply or else. That's when I knew this HOA shouldn't exist anywhere near my land. Because real authority doesn't hide paperwork, real law doesn't rush, and real boundaries don't change just because someone with money and ambition wants them to. I started documenting everything. Every letter, every visit, every fine, because I could feel it in my bones. This wasn't enforcement, it was a setup. The letters started arriving almost daily after that. Thick envelopes, certified mail, bright orange stickers screaming urgency. Every single one listed a new violation, and every violation carried a fine that compounded by the day. According to the HOA, my tractor was an industrial vehicle that violated residential standards. The hay bales stacked near the south barn were considered unsightly storage. The cattle themselves were labeled a noise nuisance, as if livestock hadn't been part of this valley longer than any subdivision sign ever would be. One notice accused my irrigation system of causing runoff risk to HOA property, even though the ditches had been there since my grandfather dug them and the water never crossed my boundary. Another claimed dust from my access road posed a health concern to nearby residents. Each violation came with language that sounded official but said almost nothing concrete. No statutes, no clear authority. Just vague references to HOA bylaws I had never agreed to and had never legally been subject to. The fines stacked fast. $100 a day, $200 a day. Penalties layered on penalties. It wasn't enforcement. It was pressure, designed to overwhelm, confuse, and exhaust me into paying or folding. What made it worse was how personal it felt. HOA board members began driving by the property slowly, sometimes twice a day, phones held up, taking pictures like I was running a crime scene instead of a working farm. I'd look up from fixing a fence and see a car idling on the county road, someone zooming in on my barns, my cattle, my house. No wave, no greeting, just documentation. Then the flyers started showing up around Juniper Ridge Estates. A neighbor slipped one into my mailbox one evening, looking embarrassed. The paper accused my farm of lowering property values. It warned residents about environmental contamination, livestock hazards, and unregulated agricultural activity. My name wasn't printed, but everyone knew who they meant. They painted me as a reckless holdout refusing to modernize, a danger standing in the way of progress. Grief does strange things to your sense of balance. There were nights I sat at the kitchen table, Lillian's mug still in the cabinet above me, staring at stacks of paper and feeling completely alone. This land was supposed to be where I healed. Instead, it felt like I was being surrounded, slowly and deliberately, by people who wanted me gone. I tried to handle it the right way. Professional. I sent formal letters requesting proof of jurisdiction. I asked for the original boundary survey. I asked for recorded county filings. I asked for meeting minutes authorizing enforcement actions against my property. Each letter was polite, measured, and cited basic legal requirements. None of them were answered. Instead, I received more fines. Elaine Prescott never responded directly. Communication came through generic HOA emails signed by the board. When I called the management number listed, I was told my inquiries were under review. When I showed up at a publicly listed meeting, I was informed it had been rescheduled. No notice. No apology. It was a classic tactic. Delay. Obscure. Overwhelm. I started sleeping lightly, listening for trucks, footsteps, anything out of place. I found myself checking fences more often, walking boundaries with a sense of dread I hadn't felt since Lillian got sick. I hated that they were turning my own land into something that felt hostile. One afternoon, I caught two board members standing near my eastern fence line, pointing and taking notes. When I approached, they stiffened, said nothing, and left. That silence spoke louder than any threat. They didn't see me as a neighbor. They saw me as an obstacle. I wrote one final letter, requesting immediate proof of jurisdiction and demanding that all enforcement cease until it was produced. I referenced county statutes. I referenced case law. I made it clear that continued action without authority would be unlawful. The response came 3 days later. Not a letter, a notice. It announced a closed emergency HOA meeting to address ongoing risks posed by adjacent agricultural operations. No agenda details, no mention of my right to attend. No invitation. I read it twice, then a third time, my hands steady even though my chest felt tight. That's when it clicked. They weren't planning to argue with me anymore. They were planning to move without me, and whatever they were about to decide, they didn't want the owner of 3,500 acres or a retired property attorney anywhere near the room when it happened. I didn't hear about the emergency assessment from the HOA. I heard about it from Raymond Cole, a rancher who'd lived down the road longer than I'd been alive. He pulled up beside me one afternoon while I was repairing a gate, engine still running, face tight in a way that told me the news wasn't good. "They voted on you," he said, not bothering with small talk. Closed meeting. Emergency assessment. I wiped my hands on my jeans and asked how much. Raymond hesitated before answering. A little over $40,000. According to the board, my farm had caused significant wear and damage to HOA roads. They claimed my irrigation runoff compromised drainage systems. They even alleged my cattle created safety hazards that required immediate infrastructure mitigation. None of it made sense. My access roads didn't even touch theirs. My water never crossed the boundary, but the language didn't matter. What mattered was the number and the word they kept repeating. Emergency. That word is powerful when it's abused. It justifies speed. It bypasses discussion. It lets people act first and explain later. And in this case, it was the excuse they needed to levy a massive charge without my presence, my consent, or any proof. Raymond told me the board spoke confidently, like everything was already settled. Elaine Prescott led the meeting. She showed charts. Photos taken from angles meant to exaggerate everything. She talked about liability and risk and how the community had to act before it was too late. I didn't say much after Raymond left. I went inside, pulled out the fireproof box I kept under the bed, and laid its contents across the kitchen table. Original land patents. Recorded surveys. Deeds going back decades. Every document that proved, beyond any reasonable doubt, that Whitmore Hollow Farm existed long before Juniper Ridge Estates ever dreamed up a welcome sign. If they wanted to play paperwork games, I was done playing defense. The next HOA meeting was listed as open to residents. I showed up uninvited. The room went quiet when I walked in. Folding chairs. A projector screen. Elaine Prescott standing at the front, mid-sentence, her smile freezing when she saw me. She hadn't expected me to show. She definitely hadn't expected the thick folder under my arm. When public comment opened, I stood and introduced myself calmly. No anger. No raised voice. I laid the documents out one by one. I explained, clearly and simply, that my land predated the HOA by generations, that there was no lawful mechanism by which my property could be placed under their jurisdiction without my consent and county approval. I cited survey references, recording numbers, and boundary descriptions that left no room for interpretation. The room shifted. People whispered. A few homeowners looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. Elaine didn't. She glanced at the documents briefly, then waved them away like clutter. She said the HOA had updated information and that my materials were outdated. When I asked her to produce her version of the boundary filings, she said they were proprietary. When I asked what statute allowed an HOA to impose an emergency assessment on land it did not legally govern, she smiled thinly and said their attorneys were confident. Then she threatened legal action. She said if I continued to interfere with HOA operations, they would pursue remedies to protect the community. She said unpaid assessments would be enforced to the fullest extent allowed. The message was clear. They weren't interested in whether they were right. They were interested in whether I could outlast them. As I sat back down, something inside me shifted. Up until that moment, I'd been reacting, writing letters, asking questions, hoping logic would stop something that was clearly irrational. That hope died in that chair. From that point forward, I stopped treating this like a misunderstanding and started treating it like a case. I documented everything. I requested certified copies of filings. I logged every violation notice and every fine calculation. I recorded dates, times, and names. I photographed drive-bys. I saved flyers. I backed up emails in multiple places. I stopped responding emotionally and started responding strategically. Because I finally saw the shape of what they were doing. The fines weren't meant to be paid. The emergency assessment wasn't meant to be negotiated. The paperwork delays weren't accidental. They were bleeding me intentionally, piling numbers high enough to justify a lien, moving fast enough to foreclose before anyone could step in. This wasn't about tractors or dust or cattle. It was about forcing a property owner into default. As I drove home that night, the sun dropping low over the pasture, I realized something else that made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. They didn't care that this land held my family's history. They didn't care that my wife wanted to rest here. To them, Whitmore Hollow Farm wasn't legacy. It was inventory. And now that I understood that, I knew exactly how dangerous this was going to become. The first fence was cut sometime after midnight. I know that now because I walked it just before dusk and everything was intact. The posts were solid. The wire was tight. By sunrise, 3 clean gaps had been opened along the eastern boundary, cut low and wide enough for cattle to drift through without hesitation. No snapped wires, no storm damage. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. By the time I finished counting the herd, several head had wandered through the openings and onto land just outside my fence line. That's when the sirens showed up. A county cruiser rolled in first, lights flashing. Then another, and not 5 minutes later, a local news van pulled onto the shoulder like it had been waiting nearby. Elaine Prescott's black SUV followed close behind, parking at an angle that made sure the cameras caught her stepping out, phone already in hand. She spoke loudly, pointed dramatically, told officers she had warned me this would happen, told the reporter that uncontrolled livestock posed a serious danger to families in the community. She used words like negligent and reckless, shaking her head as if she were disappointed rather than pleased. I didn't raise my voice. I showed the deputy the cut fence. Clean edges, no sign of wear. No storm damage. He frowned, but procedure is procedure. The cameras didn't care about context. They wanted footage of cattle near shiny new homes, and they got it. By noon, the story was already circulating online. A rancher endangering suburban families. An outdated operation refusing to adapt. A problem that needed to be addressed. That night, I didn't sleep much, not because I was scared, but because something about it all felt too precise, too convenient. The timing, the media, the narrative ready before the facts. I'd seen this tactic before, just never aimed at me. The next morning, I drove into town and bought trail cameras. Not cheap ones, the kind hunters use when they want faces, not shadows. I mounted them along the fence line, angled carefully, hidden just enough to go unnoticed. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't confront the HOA. I just waited. It didn't take long. 3 nights later, one of the cameras pinged my phone just after 1 in the morning. I watched the clip sitting at the kitchen table, coffee going cold in my hands. A hooded figure approached the fence with bolt cutters. No hesitation, no fear. Just quick, practiced movements. The camera caught his face when he turned slightly toward the road. He was young, too young. The next afternoon, a pickup pulled into my driveway. A teenager stepped out slowly, hands shaking, eyes darting like he expected to be yelled at. He introduced himself as Noah Prescott, Elaine's nephew. He didn't last 30 seconds before breaking down. He said he'd been paid $500 to help the HOA. He said they told him it was community service, that he was fixing a problem. All he had to do was cut the fence late at night and leave. He hadn't known about the cameras. He hadn't known it would turn into police and media and accusations. He kept apologizing, voice cracking, saying he didn't want anyone hurt. I recorded the conversation with his consent. I didn't threaten him. I didn't raise my voice. I told him the truth, that he'd been used, that what he did mattered, but what mattered more was who told him to do it. That confession cracked everything wide open. Up until then, the HOA had maintained plausible deniability, aggressive enforcement, harassment, abusive procedure. All ugly, but not criminal, on their face. Sabotage changed that. Paying someone to create a violation so they could enforce against it crossed a line the paperwork couldn't hide. I sent Noah home with his father later that evening. Marcus Prescott looked like a man who had just realized how deep the hole was under his feet. He claimed he didn't know the full plan. I believed he knew more than he admitted, but that wasn't my concern anymore. That night, I pulled every public record I could find. HOA filings, corporate registrations, development permits, LLC ownership structures. What started as curiosity turned into something colder. Names repeated. Addresses overlapped. Shell companies shared managers. Development partners had quiet ties to HOA board members. Land acquisitions near Juniper Ridge Estates followed the same pattern every time. Pressure, fines, liens, transfers. Silence. This wasn't about me being stubborn or out of touch. It wasn't even about my land. It was a machine. A system designed to identify properties in the way of expansion, manufacture violations, accelerate debt, and move assets quietly into friendly hands. The HOA wasn't enforcing rules. It was clearing inventory for development, and I had just stumbled into the middle of it. Standing at the fence line the next morning, looking at the repairs I'd made, I felt something replace the anger I'd been carrying for months. Clarity. Focus. Resolve. They thought I was a grieving widower clinging to the past. They didn't realize I was documenting a conspiracy. And once a system like that is exposed, it doesn't collapse slowly. It collapses all at once. They didn't slow down after the fence incident. If anything, they accelerated. Within weeks, I received notice that the HOA had filed a lien against my property for unpaid fines and the so-called emergency assessment. $40,000 plus daily penalties, plus administrative fees that seemed to appear out of thin air. I sent formal objections. I challenged jurisdiction again. I included evidence of sabotage. None of it mattered. They had already moved on to the next step. The foreclosure notice arrived before sunrise. I found it nailed to the wooden gate at the end of my driveway, flapping slightly in the early morning wind like a warning poster. No knock. No certified mail this time. Just a thick packet stapled together, announcing that Whitmore Hollow Farm was now subject to expedited foreclosure proceedings due to unpaid HOA obligations. I stood there longer than I care to admit, holding the papers while the sky lightened over the pasture. This land had survived droughts, recessions, and 3 generations of hard living. And now a group of people who had been here less than 5 years were claiming the right to take it with a few signatures and a clock. The notice listed a sale date. Midweek, middle of the workday. Barely any lead time. The kind of scheduling designed to ensure no one shows up unless they were told to. I contacted the county clerk. The sale was on the books. Perfectly timed, perfectly quiet. Friends asked why I didn't rush to court, why I didn't file an emergency injunction, why I didn't raise hell publicly. The truth was simple and painful. I knew the system well enough to know how easily a rushed filing could be dismissed, delayed, or buried, and I knew something else too. They were making mistakes, procedural shortcuts, conflicting dates, notices served improperly, liens stacking without lawful authority. Each one was a thread, and if I pulled too early, I'd lose sight of the whole fabric, so I let it happen. The auction took place in a small courthouse room with bad lighting and folding chairs that squeaked when you shifted your weight. No crowd, no press, just a clerk, an auctioneer, and a handful of people who looked like they knew exactly why they were there. 2 bidders signed in. One was a development entity I recognized immediately, an LLC tied to multiple land acquisitions near Juniper Ridge Estates. The other was Thomas Prescott, Elaine's brother-in-law. Seeing his name on the bidder sheet felt like ice water down my spine, not because it surprised me, but because it confirmed everything. This wasn't enforcement gone wrong. This was the plan. The bidding was almost insulting. No competition, no real escalation. The gavel came down at $50,000. $50,000 for 3,500 acres. For land appraised in the millions. For land that carried my family's name. I didn't speak. I didn't object. I didn't shout. I wrote down times, names, lot numbers. I photographed the bid sheet. I recorded the auctioneer's statements. I noted the absence of disclosures that should have been required. When it was over, Thomas Prescott didn't look at me. The development representative didn't either. They shook hands quietly and left like this was just another transaction on a long list. Driving home afterward was the hardest part. Every fence line felt heavier. Every familiar landmark felt temporary, like I was already a trespasser on my own land. I pulled over near the old cottonwood, the one Lillian loved most, and sat there with the engine off, listening to the wind move through the leaves. That was the moment the grief hit hardest. Not loud, not dramatic, just deep and steady, like a weight settling into my chest. But grief wasn't the only thing there. There was clarity. They thought foreclosure was the end of the story, that once the papers changed hands, I'd disappear quietly. That exhaustion and loss would do what fines and threats couldn't. They didn't understand something fundamental. Foreclosure didn't erase evidence, it preserved it. Now there was a paper trail from start to finish. Jurisdiction claims, emergency assessments, sabotage, liens, sale, beneficiaries, every step documented, time-stamped, and traceable. And now that the land had moved, so had the spotlight. I wasn't fighting to stop them anymore. I was fighting to prove what they had done. And once you prove a system like that exists, once you show it isn't an accident or a misunderstanding, but a coordinated effort to strip property under the color of authority, the consequences don't stop with one piece of land. They spread. Standing at the edge of the pasture that evening, watching the sun drop low, I made a quiet promise to myself and to the land that had carried my family for decades. They could have the farm for now. What they couldn't have was what was coming next. Because I wasn't building an appeal. I was building a case that would take down every person who thought they could turn law into a weapon and never pay for it. Losing the farm didn't end the fight, it clarified it. Within days of the auction, my kitchen turned into a war room, not out of anger, but out of precision. I reached out to the people I trusted most, the ones who understood that this wasn't just about land anymore. The first call was to my daughter, Rachel Whitmore. She's a corporate attorney, sharper than I ever was, trained to follow money through layers most people never think to question. When I laid out what had happened, she didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I finished, she said one sentence that told me everything I needed to hear. They didn't just steal your land, they exposed themselves. Next came Samuel Klein, my former law partner. He built his reputation dismantling abusive HOAs and knew every procedural trick they liked to hide behind. When I showed him the timeline, his jaw tightened. They rush this, he said, and people who rush leave fingerprints. Victor Hale, my brother-in-law, rounded out the core. He's a retired investigator with decades of experience untangling financial crimes. He doesn't guess. He proves. And finally, there was Marianne Lewis, the owner of a local title company, who had quietly watched suspicious transfers roll through her office for years. She'd seen patterns, but never had a complete picture. Now she did. We started with the boundary amendment Elaine Prescott claimed gave the HOA authority over my land. Rachel pulled the filing from county records while Marianne compared it to archived plats. The problem jumped off the page immediately. The amendment included Whitmore Hollow Farm without any recorded consent, notice, or hearing. That alone was enough to raise serious questions. Then Victor noticed something worse. The surveyor's signature. The name belonged to a man who had died months before the document was supposedly executed. There was no ambiguity. We confirmed it through licensing records and an obituary. The document that allowed the HOA to touch my land was forged. That single detail turned everything radioactive. Samuel dug into the foreclosure paperwork and followed the chain of ownership from the auction. The trail ran exactly where we expected. Thomas Prescott held the property briefly, then it moved through a shell company. Then another. Each one clean on the surface, each one tied back through shared managers, addresses, and filing agents. Eventually, the line stopped at Elaine Prescott. Not directly, she was smarter than that. But the controlling interest led back to her. Quiet. Buried. Undeniable. She hadn't just enforced HOA rules. She had engineered a transfer designed to land my farm in her control while pretending to be an impartial authority. And it wasn't just me. Marianne pulled older records. Similar foreclosures. Similar emergency assessments. Similar quiet auctions. Different properties, same structure. Each time, longtime landowners were pressured, fined, and removed. Each time, the land eventually landed in friendly hands tied to development interests. This wasn't corruption by accident. It was an enterprise. That's when I stopped thinking like a defendant and started thinking like a landowner again. There's a tool most people don't realize exists, buried in agricultural law and preservation statutes. An agricultural preservation district. When properly established, it has lawful authority to protect farmland from inappropriate development and to acquire land based on agricultural use value, not speculative market pricing. Rachel confirmed it was viable. Samuel confirmed it was enforceable. Victor confirmed the timing was perfect. We moved fast, but clean. The district was established with full transparency. Public notice. Hearings. Environmental findings. Everything Elaine had skipped, we did by the book. Its purpose was simple and defensible. preserve working land, protect water access, and prevent predatory development. Once the district was approved, I made the announcement. Every property inside Juniper Ridge Estates fell within the district's boundaries, and under the law, that meant acquisition at agricultural value, not the inflated prices homeowners paid, not the numbers developers dreamed about, real agricultural valuation. A few $100s per half-acre lot. The same kind of math Elaine had been happy to use when it benefited her. The reaction was immediate. HOA phones lit up. Board members panicked. Homeowners demanded explanations. Elaine went silent. I wasn't taking their homes out of spite. I was using the same mechanism they had used against me, only this time it was lawful, transparent, and grounded in real authority. If they wanted to argue fairness, they could start by explaining why they thought it was fair to steal land under forged paperwork. The beauty of it wasn't revenge. It was symmetry. They weaponized procedure. I followed it. They hid documents. I exposed them. They moved fast to trap one man. I moved carefully to protect land from a system that never should have existed. For the first time since this began, I slept through the night, because now the pressure wasn't on me anymore. It was on every person who had signed off on a lie, every official who had looked the other way, and every HOA board member who thought authority was something you could fake long enough to get rich. They built their power on paper, and paper was about to bring the whole thing down. The county meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday evening, right when people usually want to be home eating dinner or watching television. Instead, the chamber was packed. Word had spread fast once notices about the Agricultural Preservation District went out. Homeowners from Juniper Ridge Estates filled the seats, whispering in clusters, clutching printed emails and half-understood legal notices. Reporters lined the back wall. County staff stood stiffly near the exits. Elaine Prescott arrived late. She walked in like someone who still believed she was in control. Perfect posture. Confident smile. A leather folder tucked under her arm. She nodded to a few board members, took a seat near the front, and crossed her legs like this was just another presentation she planned to dominate. When my name was called, the room went quiet. I didn't start with emotion. I started with facts. I laid out the timeline slowly and clearly, projecting documents onto the screen behind me. The original boundary maps showing Whitmore Hollow Farm outside any HOA jurisdiction. The amended filing that suddenly included my land, dated months after Juniper Ridge Estates was established. Then the signature. I showed the licensing record. Then the obituary. A murmur rippled through the room as people realized what they were looking at, a dead man's name authorizing a living theft. Elaine shifted in her seat. Next came the recordings. Audio clips played through the chamber speakers. Elaine's voice, unmistakable, discussing enforcement strategy. Talking about accelerating pressure, about using fines to force resolution, about how certain properties needed to move before development could proceed. She stared straight ahead, jaw tight, smile gone. Then Rachel walked the room through the financial trail. Shell companies, overlapping managers, quiet transfers. Every arrow on the chart led back to the same place. Elaine Prescott didn't just preside over the HOA, she profited from it. Samuel followed with the legal consequences: mail fraud, filing false instruments, conspiracy, abuse of office. Each charge grounded in specific acts already shown on the screen. No speculation, no drama. Just exposure. By the time Victor finished explaining how evidence had been preserved and delivered to investigators weeks earlier, Elaine was no longer pretending to take notes. She stood abruptly, interrupting the meeting, shouting about harassment and conspiracy. She accused me of manipulation, of revenge, of overreach. That's when the county attorney stood up. He said the words Elaine had never expected to hear in public. This matter is no longer civil. Two deputies stepped forward. Elaine looked around, searching for someone to back her up. No one moved. Her board members avoided her eyes. The room held its breath as the deputies placed her hands behind her back and secured the cuffs. The sound was loud in the silence. Elaine Prescott was escorted out of the chamber, shouting protests that echoed down the hallway and faded as the doors closed behind her. The collapse was immediate. Board members began talking over each other. Some claimed ignorance. Others blamed Elaine entirely. One resigned on the spot. Another demanded legal counsel. Homeowners shouted questions from the audience, realizing for the first time that the HOA they trusted had used their dues and authority to steal land and expose them to massive legal risk. Panic set in fast. People demanded to know what the Agricultural Preservation District meant for their homes. Whether they could lose them, whether they had been lied to, whether they had unknowingly participated in something criminal. I stood again, not as an accuser, but as a neighbor. I explained that the district existed to protect land, not punish homeowners, that the real targets were the people who had abused power and process, that transparency and cooperation would matter moving forward. But the damage was already done. The HOA board fractured in real time. Alliances dissolved. Emails went unanswered. Authority evaporated the moment the truth hit daylight. By the end of the meeting, reporters were filing stories, investigators were collecting records, and Juniper Ridge Estates was no longer a luxury development. It was a crime scene made of paper. As I walked out into the cool night air, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter. Final. They had built their control on silence, speed, and the assumption that no one would push back hard enough to expose them. They were wrong. And now every person in that room understood something they should have known from the start. An HOA is only as powerful as the lies it gets away with. And once those lies are exposed, the fall isn't gradual. It's absolute. The weeks after that meeting felt unreal. Investigations moved quickly once the truth was out. The HOA was suspended, then formally dissolved as records were unwound and authority stripped away. Properties that had been rushed through shady transfers were pulled back into review one by one. And eventually, after months of filings, hearings, and corrections, Whitmore Hollow Farm was restored to my name. I walked the fence lines again, not as someone bracing for the next attack, but as an owner who could finally breathe. The land hadn't changed. The cottonwood still caught the wind the same way. The pasture still glowed gold at sunset. This time, when I scattered Lillian's ashes where she asked, there was no anger left in me, just peace. I never sold the farm. I placed it under permanent preservation so it could never be carved up by the next ambitious group with a clipboard and a smile. What my grandfather built wasn't meant to be flipped. It was meant to last. Rachel took everything she learned from this fight and built a legal practice focused entirely on protecting homeowners and landowners from abusive HOAs. Every time she helps someone stand their ground, it feels like this land is doing its job all over again. What this experience taught me is simple. Bullies don't win because they're powerful. They win because they move fast, create confusion, and count on people staying quiet long enough to be crushed. But paperwork doesn't lie forever. Documents tell stories, and when you take the time to read them, verify them, and preserve them, the truth always surfaces. If an HOA has ever tried to intimidate you into giving up what you work for, don't assume you're alone. Silence is the system's favorite ally. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?